So hello. So I will maybe start with a bit of a background. So why privacy is important in smart grids. It has been said already yesterday, but I will just mention that we have new roles introduced in energy market. So beside the classical interaction between end user and DSO or energy supplier, for billing purposes, we now have aggregator services for demand response. And aggregators collect high frequency and high volume data from the customer premises. And we are talking not only consumption data, but also generation or other sensing information about temperature, for example. And also we have applications for monitoring and analytics of data provided for prosumers and provided by ESCOs, so energy service companies. So we have all of this high frequency and high volume data being fed to the smart grid stakeholders. And as we know, this data can reveal personal information about the person's behavior at home. And therefore, there are several privacy impacts, privacy risks associated with it. So to start with, we have classical identity theft, which can lead to fraud. We can determine personal behavior patterns, which can be used for profiling, abusive profiling, of course, and then targeted home invasions. So if we know that, for example, parents are not at home, it can, attacker can, kidnapper can know when to kidnap kids, for example. That's a very, very drastic example. Then we have, we can determine specific appliances that are used and also state of these appliances. So this could be used for targeted advertisement. And last but not least, smart meters enable real-time surveillance that can be abused by law enforcement or even landlords to spy on their renters, for example. So all of these impacts, they don't really encourage people to have smart meters installed at home. And therefore, there is a new general data protection regulations introduced this year. Last year it has been adopted. And it regulates how the data, what are the conditions under which data can be collected. And also it is now, it will be mandated that every service that processes and collects personal data is subjected to data protection impact assessment. And this comes as a law in 2018 in May. So in terms of guidelines for smart grid and smart metering systems, we have a template produced by Smart Grid Task Force, and it proposes a risk-oriented approach to the privacy impact assessment, and it's intended to be included in broader risk management process. And the most recent available version is from 2014, but we are waiting for the final revised version of the template, which is expected this or next month. So what's the goal of, what are the aims of the assessment? It's to determine what data is being collected, what are the risks to the rights of data subjects, and how to mitigate these risks, how to ensure that system is actually privacy preserving. And so the template also defines the process which needs to be followed to assess the risks. So after the pre-assessment, where we determined if the DPIA is needed, then the team members are defined, the system is described, this is part of the context establishment, and then we have 3 steps which correspond to risk assessment. So we identify risks, we determine the likelihood and impact of these risks, and then try to provide controls that could mitigate these risks. Finally, we have reporting and documentation of results and review and maintenance. So we can see that the process is pretty complex, and it requires a lot of information sharing, exchanging, collecting, and discussions among the team members of the DPIA team. And as has been pointed out in feedback from the DSOs who reviewed the template, the tool supporting the implementation of such a process would be of great benefit. And therefore, in AIT, we developed something like this. And the next steps will just show some screenshots of how the tool looks like. So we have a main dashboard with list of questionnaires, assessments, with also completeness. So there is a progress bar that we can see how complete a certain questionnaire is. So I use questionnaire and assessment interchangeably. And then if we take a look at the first questionnaire here, which is more complete, we can see the details. And we have a list of team members with their responsibilities. And also throughout the process, we have also all the steps as a navigation bar, so we know where we are in the process. Then system description. In the template, it was quite confusing. So we tried to make it very, very explicit and use case oriented. So the main idea is to get information about what are the primary assets, what is the personal data being exchanged. So this is here as information producer, receiver, and is information exchange per each use case scenario step. Then we have, from these descriptions, from use case descriptions, we can deduce what are our primary assets, so personal data that is being collected and processed. And then we have also supporting assets, which is the underlying infrastructure, so all the components, hardware, software, and networking components that are relevant for particular primary asset. And then the risk is defined by threat so it's jeopardy to the primary asset through attack via the underlying infrastructure, so supporting assets. And we are assessing the likelihood of the threats to the components, basically. And the assessment is done by 2 values. We estimate the level of vulnerability of the component and the attacker motivation and capability. And this adds up to a likelihood. And these values are, so it's a 4-level scale to estimate these values, ranging from negligible, then limited, significant, and maximum. And the same applies to impact assessment. So here we take a look at the consequences, and also we know what are the associated threats. And here values are level of identification, so how easy it is to identify person by particular primary assets, so data that we have. And then what are the consequences of this data being compromised. And this adds up to an impact. And finally, we have a risk treatment step where controls to threats are listed. We also introduced an additional step, which is mainly focused on rights of a data subject. So it's more or less a compliance check. So we need to make sure that it's the minimal data that we are gathering, that all of the data is gathered under certain conditions and not only secured, but also the volume of data is controlled, for example. So it's in summary, we identified 5 features that we think is important in our tool. First is that we support distributed teamwork. The tool guides. Okay. The tool guides through a user through the process and also provides some hints about the required input. Also catalogs. User can choose from catalog threads, for example. The content is pre-selected, so only, as an example, only threads of certain relevant for certain component type are listed. And finally, we have automatically generated DPIA report. So all of these features, in our opinion, makes the process easier to implement and more pleasant. It's more straightforward. We have conducted several DPIA workshops, and we learned a bit what needs to be changed in the process and in the tool to enhance the user experience. And this is our future work. And we are also waiting for the next version of the DPIA template, which is about to be released soon, and to align our process to what's new. Okay, thank you. That would be all from my side. Thank you for your attention.